A wealthy man saw a girl with a prosthetic leg in the park. He had no idea that she was his daughter, whom he had not heard from in many years. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are from. The park was quiet that afternoon, wrapped in the slow melancholy of late autumn. A fine layer of brittle leaves lay scattered across the winding paths, turning beneath the occasional footfall into a faint whisper of decay. The trees, half bare, stretched their limbs toward a pale sky, the sun faintly glimmering behind drifting veils of cloud. On benches spaced along the path sat the last of the season's visitors, elderly men in heavy coats reading newspapers, mothers rocking strollers, solitary walkers who lingered as if they had nowhere else to be. The air was crisp and dry, carrying the faint metallic scent of cold iron from the railings and lampposts, mixed with the earthy aroma of damp soil beneath the trees. Danielle Wilson walked these paths without any purpose other than escape. His steps were steady, measured, but empty of direction, as though the man himself had become little more than another figure moving idly through the park. He was impeccably dressed, as he always was, dark wool coat tailored to perfection, polished shoes that clicked softly against the stone, a scarf of muted gray draped carelessly yet precisely across his shoulders. To anyone watching, he looked like a man completely in control of his life, successful, wealthy, composed. Yet behind the calm mask of his expression was an inner dissonance, a hollow echo of something missing, something that years of wealth and triumph had failed to fill. This was his habit when the weight of his own success pressed too heavily on him. Retreat into the quiet of this park, away from the phones that never stopped ringing, the meetings that never ceased, the numbers and deals that defined every waking moment. Here among the brittle leaves and the shadows of the trees, he could at least pretend to be just another passerby. But that afternoon, something unexpected caught his attention and broke the dull rhythm of his wandering. At the far end of the path, on a weathered wooden bench, sat a small girl. She was hunched forward, her shoulders curled as if she were trying to shrink into herself, her hands grasping at a sneaker that dangled awkwardly from one foot. Her face was hidden at first, bent low, strands of dark hair falling across her cheeks. Danielle slowed, watching without intention, until the details drew him in. The sneaker had slipped off, revealing not the natural curve of a child's leg, but the pale outline of a prosthetic limb, gleaming faintly beneath the fabric of her leggings. Around her circled several boys, no older than she, their laughter sharp in the quiet air. They pointed, snickered, muttered things too faint for Danielle to catch at first, but the tone was unmistakable, the cruel edge of children who sense weakness and seize it. The girl's fingers tightened desperately around her shoe, her head bowed further, as though if she could only make herself invisible, the voices would vanish. Her body trembled with the effort of holding back tears, but her silence only seemed to encourage the boys more. Daniel felt an ache stir in his chest, sudden and unwelcome. The scene before him was too familiar in its cruelty. Memory surged up from years long buried. A boy in tattered shoes, himself standing in a schoolyard, while other children laughed at the holes in his socks, at the smell of poverty that clung to him. He remembered the heat of shame, the helplessness, the fierce determination that someday no one would ever laugh at him again. It was that promise which had driven him into the life he now lived, a life of immaculate control, relentless ambition, untouchable wealth. And yet, standing on the path, he felt as though he were once again that humiliated boy, staring at a reflection of himself in this child. He stopped. Something urged him forward, a force that rose not from logic or habit but from instinct. He approached slowly, his polished shoes crunching the leaves, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the bench. The boys noticed first, their jeers faltering into silence under the weight of an adult's presence. One by one, they shifted uneasily, muttered excuses, and drifted away, glancing back with guilty eyes. The girl did not look up. She clutched the sneaker as though it were a shield, her thin shoulders trembling. Daniel lowered himself carefully to one knee before her. He saw now the delicate features of her face, pale and streaked with tears, the tight press of her lips as she fought to stay silent. Gently, without a word, he reached for the sneaker. Her hands flinched, reluctant to let it go. But at last she allowed it. With surprising care, Danielle slid the shoe back onto the foot of the prosthetic, adjusting it so that it sat firmly in place. The small act, so simple, felt strangely profound. He tightened the laces, pulling them neatly into a bow, remembering with sudden clarity the clumsy knots he had once tied on his own shoes when no one else had been there to help him. When he finished, he looked up. The girl's eyes, large and wet with unshed tears, met his. They were not only filled with sadness, but with something stronger, a stubborn spark that seemed to resist the humiliation she had endured. For a brief moment, Daniel felt as though the world around them had narrowed to the single connection, an unspoken understanding between a weary man and a fragile child who carried within her the same scars he once bore. She whispered her name, Sophia. The sound of it lingered in the air, soft and uncertain, yet carrying an echo of resilience. Daniel repeated it silently to himself, committing it to memory, as though the name itself contained a weight he could not ignore. And then a sudden movement broke the fragile stillness. A woman came rushing down the path, her steps quick and uneven, her face pale with alarm. She reached the bench and pulled the girl into her arms, her eyes flashing with protective fear as she turned on Danielle. She was beautiful, though her features bore the marks of exhaustion and strain. Lines etched by sleepless nights, shadows beneath her eyes, hair tied back in haste. Her clothes were simple, practical, worn with the air of someone who thought little of appearances and everything of survival. The child clung to her mother, bearing her face against the woman's shoulder. Danielle rose slowly, startled by the intensity of the mother's gaze. It was then, in that charged instant, that recognition struck him. He knew her. Beneath the years and the weariness, beneath the anger now blazing in her eyes, was a face he had once loved, a woman he had once held close. Rachel. The world seemed to tilt around him. He stared, struggling to reconcile the memory of the woman who had disappeared from his life without explanation, with the mother who now stood fiercely guarding her child, and the child herself, Sophia, the fragile, trembling figure with the prosthetic limb. The realization came like a blow. She could be his daughter. Rachel turned away, pulling Sophia close, her body forming a shield between them and him. Daniel remained motionless, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with questions, with disbelief, with the sudden, terrifying possibility that the emptiness he had carried for so long had a name, a face, a life he had never known. And in that moment, as the pale light of late autumn fell across the path, Danielle Wilson understood that nothing in his carefully constructed world would ever be the same again. The evening after the encounter in the park, Danielle returned to his apartment as though crossing into another world. The glass towers of the city glimmered behind him, their windows ablaze with artificial fire, and the hum of traffic rose and fell like the breath of some vast, mechanical beast. His driver left him at the entrance of the building that had long been his sanctuary, though tonight it felt more like a prison than a home. The lobby lights gleamed against marble floors polished to a sterile perfection, and the elevator carried him upward in silence. When the doors opened, the vast expanse of his penthouse swallowed him whole. The place was immaculate, every surface shining, every piece of furniture positioned with the precision of a showroom. Yet it breathed no life. The long expanse of the glass wall gave him a commanding view of the city below, the endless pulse of lights and motion, but the grandeur left him cold. He removed his coat, loosened his scarf, and sat in one of the leather chairs near the window, staring at his own reflection in the darkened glass. What he saw was a man composed on the outside, but unsettled within, his mind drifting back to the bench in the park, to the small figure of the girl, and the sudden eruption of recognition in her mother's face. Rachel. He had not spoken her name in years, but it came back with the sharpness of a blade. Time had weathered her, yes, but he had known her instantly. He had once loved her with a reckless intensity that had surprised even himself, back in a time when ambition had not yet drowned out every other sound in his life. And then, without warning, she had left. No explanations, no final words, only absence, a hollow space where she had been. He had buried that wound beneath years of deals, triumphs, and the relentless forward march of his career, convincing himself it was forgotten. But today it had reopened with a force that staggered him. And then there was the child, Sophia, the name whispered in his memory like a secret prayer. He replayed every detail of her in his mind, the fragile posture, the sneaker slipping from the prosthetic limb, the tears she tried so hard to hide, and above all, the moment her eyes had met his. There had been something in them that shook him, not merely the spark of resilience that reminded him of his own struggles, but a thread of familiarity, as if a part of himself had looked back at him through her. The possibility gnawed at him now, insistent and unrelenting. Could she be his? He rose and began to pace the room, the measured rhythm of his footsteps the only sound in the cavernous silence. He tried to summon logic, to tell himself that it was coincidence, that children often resembled those they were not related to, that he was leaping to conclusions. And yet Rachel's sudden defensiveness, her refusal to let him close, her hurried retreat, it all pointed toward a truth she had tried to bury. He remembered her departure all those years ago, her words about not belonging to his world, about not wanting to live in a place where money dictated every choice. At the time, he had taken her words as a rejection of him, of who he was becoming. Now, as he pieced together the fragments, he saw something else. Perhaps she had not left him at all, but had left for the sake of a child he had never known. Danielle moved toward his study, where papers and contracts lay stacked in orderly rows. He ignored them. For once, business felt insignificant, like an empty shell. He opened a drawer and retrieved a pen, then took from a folder a request form he had already asked his assistant to prepare earlier that day, as though some instinct had compelled him to act before doubt could paralyze him. It was the authorization for a DNA test. His signature, bold and deliberate, slid across the page, binding him to the pursuit of truth. As he set down the pen, a tremor of fear passed through him. He had faced hostile boardrooms, courtroom battles, public scrutiny, but nothing had ever made him feel as exposed as this piece of paper. For once, the stakes were not measured in millions, but in blood. The following days stretched into a haze of unease. He continued to fulfill his obligations, attending meetings, signing documents, shaking hands, but all of it blurred into a monotony he scarcely registered. His mind returned again and again to Sophia. He imagined her at school, navigating hallways filled with whispers, enduring stares at her prosthetic leg. He saw her sitting alone with a book or playing with hesitant motions, while other children ran freely. He wondered how much pain she carried within, and whether anyone had told her she was strong, not despite her differences, but because of them. He began to see Rachel differently, too. When he had first recognized her in the park, his immediate reaction had been a surge of anger at her silence all these years. But in the quiet of his apartment, surrounded by the emptiness of his success, he reconsidered. He thought of the weariness in her face, the lines carved not by vanity, but by sacrifice, the clothes chosen for practicality rather than display. She had raised Sophia alone, through hardship, without leaning on him or his wealth. Was it out of pride? Out of fear? Or had she simply believed he would not have been the father their daughter needed? He remembered her laughter from years ago, how light it had been, unburdened, before his ambition had consumed every part of him. He remembered her walking away, her shoulders squared, her resolve unshaken, leaving him in stunned silence. He had told himself she was selfish. Now he wondered if she had been braver than he had ever realized. On a quiet evening, he found himself at his desk again, staring at a photograph he had once hidden at the bottom of a drawer. It was of Rachel, taken in the early days of their relationship. She was smiling in the sunlight, her eyes half closed, hair blowing across her face. He traced the outline of her figure with his gaze, and in that moment, he saw traces of Sophia in her, the same delicate chin, the same quiet intensity in the eyes. It seemed absurd that he had not noticed it instantly in the park. Perhaps he had, but had been too stunned to admit it. The test results would take time, but he already felt as though he knew. The knowledge pressed upon him like the inevitability of the tide, and yet beneath that certainty there was fear. Fear that Rachel would never forgive him for the life he had chosen over her. Fear that Sophia, if she learned the truth, would not want him in her world. Fear that he was too late, that the chance to be a father had slipped beyond his grasp before he had even known it existed. And yet, for all the doubts, he could not turn away. He had built an empire from nothing, had faced down rivals and overcome every obstacle, but never had he been so unprepared. For once, he did not want to conquer or control. He wanted only to be present, to mend what had been broken, to hold on to this fragile thread that tied him to the girl in the park. Rachel, however, remained a barrier. Their brief encounters after that day had been cautious, restrained. She kept her distance, her body language always defensive, her eyes always wary. She allowed him to speak with Sophia only briefly, in her presence, never leaving the two alone. The air between them was heavy with mistrust. Danielle could see that she was torn apart of her reluctant to deny the bond she saw forming. Part of her terrified that allowing him closer would shatter the fragile stability she had built. Sophia herself was different. Though shy and uncertain, she watched him with curiosity, as though studying a puzzle she could not yet solve. She did not ask for explanations, nor did she recoil from his presence. Instead, she seemed to weigh his every gesture, as though searching for something she had not yet named. Danielle sensed that she carried burdens heavier than a child should bear. The prosthetic was not merely a physical challenge, but a symbol of the difference that set her apart, the reason for the whispers and the cruelty of her peers. He longed to tell her that she was more than enough, that she was extraordinary, but words felt inadequate. He knew that only his presence, his actions would matter. One afternoon, he glimpsed her leaving school. She walked slowly, her step uneven but determined, her small backpack swaying with each motion. Children passed her by, some glancing, some whispering, some ignoring her entirely. She kept her gaze lowered, as though retreating into herself. Rachel was waiting nearby, her protective stance unyielding, yet her eyes softened as Sophia approached. Danielle watched from a distance, unnoticed, and in that moment he felt both admiration and sorrow. Admiration for the strength of the two of them, sorrow for the years he had missed. When he returned to his apartment that evening, the city spread before him once more like a glittering stage, but he no longer felt the same sense of mastery he once did. He was a man divided, pulled between the life he had built and the life he might have had, between the certainty of his empire and the uncertainty of fatherhood. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he could not buy what he wanted most. Trust could not be purchased. Love could not be signed into existence with a contract, and a child's acceptance could not be earned with wealth, but only with presence. As the nights passed and the days folded into one another, Danielle's resolve deepened. He would not turn away, no matter how much resistance he faced from Rachel, no matter how guarded Sophia remained. He had found something in that park bench more valuable than anything he had acquired in his years of success. He had found a chance, fragile and uncertain, but real. And though doubt gnawed at him, though memories of his failures whispered that he would falter, he clung to that chance as though it were his last. The city lights glittered below him like a sea of fire, but Danielle no longer felt warmed by their glow. His gaze turned inward, to the girl with the trembling shoulders and the prosthetic shoe, to the woman who had once walked away and who now stood between him and the truth. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt something stir in him that was not ambition, not conquest, but hope. And so the nights continued, heavy with waiting, heavy with questions, until the moment arrived when truth could no longer be delayed, and the fragile threads of past and present would be woven together into a future neither he nor Rachel had ever imagined. The results of the test arrived on a morning as gray and indifferent as any other. Yet for Daniel Wilson, the day would be remembered as the moment his life divided cleanly into before and after. He had told himself he was prepared, that he already knew the truth deep within his bones, that the confirmation would be little more than a formality. But when the envelope was placed in his hands and he opened it with deliberate slowness, the words on the page struck him with a force that no boardroom decision, no market crash, no scandal had ever carried. The certainty was there in black and white. Sophia was his daughter, his blood, his lineage, his continuation. He read the words again and again, as if repetition might make them less overwhelming, but with each reading the weight only grew heavier. He sat for a long time in silence, staring at the paper until the letters blurred. There was joy, fierce and undeniable, but tangled within it was fear so sharp it bordered on pain. He thought of the years already gone, the birthdays uncelebrated, the tears unshed in his presence, the first steps and first words that had passed without his knowing. He had missed it all. What right did he have now to claim the title of father? He was entering her life not at the beginning, but in the middle, a stranger trying to wear the mantle of kinship. The triumph of the truth was tempered by the guilt of absence. Rachel received the confirmation with a face as unreadable as stone. When he showed her the results, she did not flinch, nor did she argue. She only nodded, a brief, weary motion, and for a moment Danielle thought he saw a flicker of relief in her eyes, as though the burden of secrecy had at last lifted. But the relief was overshadowed by something else, something deeper fear of what his presence would bring into the fragile world she had built with Sophia. He longed to demand answers, to ask why she had hidden their daughter for so long, why she had believed he could not be trusted. But the words died on his tongue. He sensed that pressing her would only drive her further away. For a time, he allowed himself to imagine that the revelation would bring them closer, that the acknowledgement of truth would lay a foundation for something new. But the world beyond their fragile triangle had other plans. The secret once kept for so many years did not remain hidden for long. Someone spoke, or perhaps someone saw, or perhaps it was simply the inevitability of his public life. Whatever the cause, the story spilled into the press like oil across water, spreading swiftly, coating everything it touched. Headlines appeared overnight. Photographers lurked near Rachel's modest apartment, their lenses hungry for glimpses of the child who had become a sensation without ever asking for attention. Newspapers speculated about the billionaire's hidden heir, about the scandal of a daughter born in secrecy, about the implications for inheritance and reputation. The story became fodder for talk shows, dinner conversations, and the endless chatter of the internet. Strangers dissected the life of a little girl they had never met, as if she were a character created for their entertainment. For Sophia, the change was immediate and brutal. At school, where she had already endured whispers and stares, the cruelty intensified. Children who had once ignored her now sought her out, not out of friendship but out of morbid curiosity. Some envied her, insisting she was lucky to have a father so rich, imagining gifts and privileges without understanding the truth. Others mocked her all the more fiercely, combining their ridicule of her prosthetic with sneers about being a scandal, a secret no one had wanted. She walked the halls with her shoulders hunched, her eyes on the floor, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack as though it might anchor her against the tide of voices. Rachel tried to shield her, tried to walk her to school and back, tried to assure her that the noise would fade, but Sophia could not escape the feeling that the world had turned against her. She came home in tears more often than not, retreating into silence, drawing pictures alone in her room where no one could see. The prosthetic leg, once merely a physical difference, now felt to her like a beacon marking her as forever separate. She told herself she was broken, unworthy, a mistake, and nothing Rachel said seemed able to pierce that wall of self-loathing. Danielle, meanwhile, faced the storm in his own way. He had endured public scrutiny before rumors of affairs, disputes with rivals, the glare of financial investigations. But nothing had ever felt so personal. This was not about numbers or deals. This was about his daughter. When he saw her picture printed in papers, her name twisted into headlines designed to sell, he felt a fury rise within him that eclipsed anything he had known. For the first time in his life, he found himself stepping before cameras, not as a businessman, not as a figure of power, but as a father. At a press conference hastily arranged to halt the frenzy, he stood before the microphones, his face grave but his voice steady. He declared that Sophia was not a scandal, not a curiosity, not a pawn in the games of the press. She was his daughter, and he would not allow anyone to diminish her worth. He spoke of her courage, of the quiet strength he had seen in her eyes, of the resilience that inspired him more than any victory he had achieved in his career. His words, though measured, carried a rawness that surprised those who had long known him as a man of calculated detachment. For the first time, he allowed the world to see his vulnerability. Sophia heard his speech later that evening, sitting on the sofa with Rachel, the television flickering in the dim light of their small living room. At first, she did not understand. She had expected him to speak as others did, to offer statements that sounded polished but empty. But as his words unfolded, something shifted inside her. He spoke as though he truly saw her, not the leg that was missing, not the prosthetic that set her apart, not the headlines that had made her a spectacle, but her. Sophia, the girl who had sat on the bench and held back tears while children laughed. The girl who had whispered her name in trembling tones. The girl who wanted nothing more than to belong. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps he would not leave, that perhaps he was not like the others who had mocked or pitied or misunderstood her, that perhaps he could be the father she had secretly wished for, even when she told herself she did not need one. Rachel noticed the change as well. She watched Sophia's face as she listened to the speech, saw the cautious hope begin to kindle in her eyes, and felt a mixture of emotions surge through her. She had wanted to keep Sophia safe by keeping Danielle at a distance, but now she saw that the girl herself was reaching out, silently but unmistakably, and she could not deny that Danielle, for all his flaws and the mistakes of the past, was trying. He was showing up not as the powerful man the world knew, but as a father. Still, Rachel's mistrust lingered. She had carried the burden alone for so long, had built her life around protecting Sophia from the world's cruelty, and the thought of surrendering even a part of that control terrified her. She feared that Danielle would tire, that his presence would fade once the novelty of fatherhood wore thin, that Sophia would be left shattered by abandonment. She could not forget the man who had once chosen ambition over love. She could not forget the pain of leaving him, convinced he would never choose them over the world he had built. But Sophia, unknowing of these doubts, began to change. The words she had heard from her father echoed in her mind, softening the sharp edges of her self-hatred. She began to draw again, but this time the pictures were different. No longer lonely figures or broken lines, but bridges stretching across wide rivers, holding strong. On one side, a small figure that was clearly her, on the other, her mother, and in the middle, tall and steady, her father. The prosthetic, which she once omitted from her drawings, was now included, not as a flaw, but as part of her. In some sketches, she even made it shine, a symbol not of weakness, but of strength. The family, fractured and uncertain, began to spend more time together. They took walks in the park, shared simple meals, sat in the quiet of evenings, where words were few but presence was enough. It was not easy. Rachel's guardedness, Danielle's inexperience, Sophia's fragility all collided at times. But beneath the strain was something new, something fragile yet undeniable. For Danielle, every moment was both a gift and a torment. A gift because he was discovering a part of life he had never known. The laughter of a child, the warmth of belonging, the simple act of being needed. A torment because he could not escape the knowledge of how much he had already lost, how much had slipped away beyond recovery. But he resolved that he would not let the future slip as the past had. He would be there now, even if late, even if imperfect. And so beneath the glare of the world's eyes, amid the whispers of society and the trials of family, something fragile began to grow. Not perfection, not harmony, but the first fragile threads of trust, woven slowly, uncertainly, but real. And Sophia, once ashamed of the sound of her prosthetic tapping against the floor, began to hear it differently as a rhythm of resilience, a song of survival, a beat that marked her steps toward becoming whole. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Danielle had ever known. For a man who had measured his life in deals closed, in empires expanded, the rhythm of family came as a revelation. Yet it was not a revelation that arrived all at once, shining and complete, but slowly, haltingly, like dawn pressing through fog. There were still mistrusts, still hesitations, still the shadows of the years that could never be erased. But there was also a movement forward, fragile yet undeniable. And for the first time in his life, Danielle felt he was building something not out of stone or steel or money, but out of presence. The legal recognition came first. Rachel, reluctant as she was, agreed to stand beside him in the quiet, wood-paneled courtroom where the matter was settled. There were no reporters allowed, no flashing cameras, only a judge with a measured voice and a clerk taking notes in deliberate strokes. Yet for Danielle, it felt larger than any public triumph he had ever experienced. When the papers were signed and Sophia's name was officially bound to his own, it was not the legality that moved him, but the symbolism. It was as though the universe itself had finally spoken aloud what he had felt from the moment he looked into the child's eyes. She was his, not by choice but by truth, and he was hers. The finality of ink on paper felt like a vow he could never take back, nor would he ever want to. Sophia had not understood the full weight of the proceeding, but she sensed enough to know that something irrevocable had happened. She looked at him afterward with cautious pride, as though testing whether he would prove worthy of the title that now belonged to him. Danielle met her gaze with a solemn promise that he did not need to speak aloud. He knew she had suffered from uncertainty, from the fear that he might vanish as quickly as he had appeared. But now the bond had a permanence that neither Rachel's fear nor society's cruelty could undo. The days that followed were filled with small, ordinary moments that in their ordinariness felt extraordinary. Danielle found himself at Rachel's modest kitchen table, eating simple meals of pasta and bread instead of dining in Michelin-starred restaurants. He helped Sophia with her school projects, fumbling through glue and paper with the awkwardness of a man unused to such tasks, but she laughed at his clumsy fingers, and in her laughter he found more joy than in any polished banquet. They walked together in the park where they had first met, Sophia's steps slow but determined, the rhythm of her prosthetic echoing softly against the pavement. For Rachel, the change was harder to accept. She watched him carefully, waiting for the moment when his resolve might falter, when his life of privilege and responsibility would pull him back into the world that had once consumed him. She held her heart in check, unwilling to believe too quickly. And yet, piece by piece, his constancy began to disarm her. He arrived when he said he would. He listened instead of commanding. He did not flinch from the difficulties, nor did he attempt to solve them with money. Slowly, against her will, she began to allow herself to believe. The true turning point came on the day of the school celebration. Each year, the children were invited to speak about family, to share something of their lives before classmates and parents gathered in the hall. For Sophia, the thought of standing before an audience was almost unbearable. She had endured enough stares, enough whispers, enough cruel laughter. But something within her had changed since her father had spoken so publicly, claiming her not as a secret, but as a source of pride. That strength had seeped into her bones, fragile though it was, and when the teacher asked if she wished to participate, she nodded. Rachel, surprised, offered to let her withdraw, but Sophia shook her head. She wanted to be heard. The day arrived, and the hall filled with parents clutching cameras with children fidgeting nervously as they awaited their turn. Rachel sat in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her breath shallow. Danielle sat beside her, his tall figure drawing curious glances, his eyes fixed only on the stage. When Sophia's name was called, she rose, her movements careful but sure, and stepped forward. The sound of her prosthetic tapping against the wooden floor carried through the silence. But for the first time, she did not hear it as a mark of shame. She heard it as a beat of courage. She stood at the podium, her small hands gripping the edges, her voice at first trembling, then steadying as the words flowed. She spoke of difference, of being singled out, of the pain of laughter that cut deeper than bruises. She spoke of loneliness, of wishing at times to disappear. But then her voice changed, warming with strength. She told them she had a family, one that had not always been complete, but was complete now. She told them that her leg might be metal, but it had carried her forward when life had tried to hold her back. She told them that weakness was not in the body, but in giving up, and that strength was in standing and walking and trying again, no matter how many times you fell. The hall was silent when she finished. Then slowly applause began, hesitant at first, then swelling into a thunder that filled the room. Parents stood, children clapped, Teachers wiped tears from their eyes. Rachel pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears slipping unbidden down her cheeks. Danielle sat motionless, his throat tight, his vision blurred, overwhelmed by the fierce pride that surged through him. He had faced victories and triumphs, but none compared to this, to the sight of his daughter standing tall, unashamed, declaring her worth to the world. Afterward, as they walked home together, Sophia skipped between them, her steps uneven but joyful. She held her mother's hand in one and her father's in the other, swinging their arms with the giddy delight of a child who had finally found her place. Rachel glanced at Danielle, their eyes meeting across Sophia's head, and for the first time in years there was no accusation in her gaze, no distance, only the fragile beginning of trust. That evening, they ate together in Rachel's small dining room. The table was crowded with papers from Sophia's school bag, with crumbs of bread and half-empty glasses, with the clutter of ordinary life. Yet to Danielle, it felt like the richest feast he had ever known. They laughed together, soft and tentative at first, then more freely, the sound filling the space with warmth that no wealth could ever purchase. It was not perfection, not the polished image of family life that might appear in magazines, but something far more valuable. It was real. In the days that followed, Danielle began to think less of what he had lost and more of what he might still build. He no longer measured success in profits or acquisitions, but in the moments when Sophia smiled without hesitation, when Rachel allowed her shoulders to relax, when the three of them sat together and silence felt comfortable instead of strained. He realized that all his life he had been constructing towers that reached toward the sky, but none of them had given him the foundation he had found here, in the modest apartment of the woman he had once loved and the daughter he had almost never known. The final image etched into his heart came one crisp afternoon in the park. They returned to the place where it had begun, the bench where Sophia had sat alone, clutching her shoe while he had been drawn into a story he had never expected. Now the scene was transformed. Sophia ran ahead, her prosthetic legs striking the ground with a steady rhythm, her laughter carried by the breeze. She was not hiding, not shrinking, not silenced. She was alive, radiant, whole. Danielle and Rachel walked behind her, their steps slow, their eyes fixed on the child who had changed them both. He reached out, and after a brief hesitation, she took his hand. They said nothing, for there was nothing to add. The sound of Sophia's footsteps was enough, the echo of resilience, the rhythm of a new beginning. And so the story that had begun with absence and secrecy found its way to presence and truth. Not perfect, not easy, but real. A family scarred and mended, fragile and strong, stepping together into a future that none of them could have imagined, but all of them were ready to claim. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. Check out more of our videos for stories you'll love, and share this one with your friends so they can enjoy it too.